On Sunday evening in May 2025, a chartered plane lifted off from Johannesburg OR Tambo International Airport. On board were 59 white South African families holding tightly to their suitcases and documents, papers they never imagined they'd need just a few months ago. These aren't tourists headed for a vacation to the US, or business travelers on a quick trip. These are refugees, officially recognized by the US government as people fleeing persecution in their own country. This flight marks the start of what the Trump administration describes as a broader relocation initiative. Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, told reporters that the experiences of these Afrikaner families reflect exactly what America's refugee program was created for. He claims they're victims of race-based persecution, forced to leave the only home they've ever known. But here's where things start to get complicated. The South African government denies any of this is happening. The grim truth about South Africa nobody wants to tell you. President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has dismissed the claims as completely unfounded, arguing that Afrikaners remain among the most economically advantaged groups in the country. So, who's telling the truth? Are these families truly being persecuted, or are they taking advantage of a friendly US administration to get a fresh start? The answer isn't black and white. In fact, it's far more complex and unsettling than either side wants to admit. What's unfolding here isn't just a political controversy, it's a symptom of something deeper, the unraveling of South Africa's post-apartheid promise. The country once held up as a beacon of hope, a place where different races could build a future together, is now facing a harsh reality. Institutions are weakening, leadership is non-existent, and ordinary people of every race are paying the price. Let me take you back to 1994, when all of this started. Apartheid officially ends, Nelson Mandela becomes president, and the world celebrates the birth of the Rainbow Nation. South Africa had Africa's most developed economy, sophisticated infrastructure that actually works, and a new constitution that legal scholars considered among the world's most progressive. Everything looked perfect on paper, and people genuinely believed that this was going to work. So, what happened? How did a country with so much promise turn into this? I'll tell you, but first hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this. Alright, so 30 years later, that dream has become a complete nightmare. The country now holds the dubious honor of having the highest inequality in the world, according to the Gini coefficient, which is saying something when you consider all of the other countries that face similar issues. The richest 10% of South Africans control between 80 to 85% of total wealth. That's not just high inequality, that's the kind of inequality that historically leads to revolutions and civil wars. What makes it even more depressing is that these economic divisions still largely follow the same racial lines that existed during apartheid. White South Africans make up roughly 7% of the population, but continue to own approximately 70% of commercial farmland and dominate most high-skilled professions. Meanwhile, unemployment among the black majority has reached levels that should terrify anyone who understands how societies work. The overall unemployment rate sits at 32.7%, but among young people, it reaches 66%. This means that 2 out of every 3 young South Africans cannot find work. We're not talking about underemployment or bad jobs here, we're talking about no jobs at all. That's not just a statistic, that's millions of people with no hope and nothing to lose. Since 1994, South Africa has been governed by the African National Congress, a party that led the fight to end apartheid. Over the years, they've rolled out affirmative action policies and land reform programs, all aimed at fixing the deep inequalities left behind by that brutal system. But here's the hard truth. After 3 decades, the core structure of South African society hasn't really changed. The people who had wealth and power during apartheid mostly still have it, and the people who were struggling back then, most of them are still struggling today. Democracy changed politics, but the economic reality barely moved. South Africans can feel the frustration almost everywhere. Politicians like Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, lean into that anger at rallies, sometimes even leading chants of old anti-apartheid songs, some of which include violent lyrics about white farmers. And he's not just some fringe figure. His party holds seats in parliament and speaks for a significant chunk of the population. These moments aren't just dramatic dramatic political stunts, they're deliberate messages aimed at millions of South Africans who feel left behind, while a small entrenched elite continues to live comfortably. At this point, you might assume that this is just a story about racial tension or white persecution, but that would be missing the much bigger, much more alarming picture. The real tragedy in South Africa isn't just about race or inequality, it's that the entire system is breaking down, affecting everyone, no matter their background. Institutions are crumbling, basic services are falling apart, and for many, hope is running out. It's a slow-motion collapse that's pulling the whole country down. But how? Well, South Africa's power grid has all but collapsed. On a good day, the state-owned utility Eskom runs at about 50% capacity. Most South Africans face load shedding, a polite term for daily planned blackouts. In some areas, the power's out for up to 12 hours at a time. Running a farm, a business, or even just a home becomes a constant guessing game. The water situation is just as bad, maybe worse. Around 30% of the country's water supply is lost through leaking pipes before it reaches anyone. Less than half of homes have reliable running water. In 2018, Cape Town nearly completely ran dry and had to impose strict rationing, just 50 litres per person per day. Transportation's falling apart too. Rail lines have been stripped for metal, exports pile up at ports for weeks, costing the economy billions and scaring off international investors. None of this happened overnight. Much of the damage stems from Jacob Zuma's presidency from 2009 to 2018, when corruption exploded. State-owned companies meant to drive development were looted instead. The Gupta family, wealthy businessmen with close ties to Zuma, allegedly handpicked ministers and shaped policy for their own personal gain. Even after Zuma was forced out and jailed, the damage was done. Trust in the government collapsed, skilled professionals left the country, and without competent people in key roles, fixing these systems has become nearly impossible. But the real crisis in South Africa goes way beyond the economy. The country has one of the highest violent crime rates in the world. Murder rates exceed those in some war zones. It ranks first globally for burglaries and rape. In many areas, homes are surrounded by electric fences and guarded by private security just to feel somewhat safe. But here's what most people miss. The majority of victims are not white farmers. They are black South Africans living in townships where there's no security, no fences, just daily fear. While farm attacks are real and sometimes brutal, they make up a tiny share of overall murders. Still, international coverage focuses almost entirely on white victims. That narrative hit a peak in February 2025, when Trump signed an executive order offering fast-track refugee status to white Afrikaners. Their cases were approved in just 3 months, an almost unheard of speed. The South African government called it a violation of sovereignty based on false claims, and many citizens, white and black, were stunned by the idea that Afrikaners are a persecuted minority needing international protection. In fact, social media blew up with memes after the charter flight took off. People joking about privileged white farmers claiming refugee status while still employing domestic workers and vacationing at beach resorts. Even the Episcopal Church in the US pulled out of its refugee resettlement program, saying it couldn't support prioritizing white South Africans over people fleeing war and disaster. But beneath the outrage and political drama, here's the reality. Those farmers were fleeing from perceived racial persecution. They were escaping a country where nothing works. Power cuts are constant, crime is out of control, and the government seems completely unable to fix the basics. And they're not alone. Over the past 20 years, hundreds of thousands of skilled South Africans, black, white, and everything in between, have left. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and business owners are building lives elsewhere. The people on the flight were just the most visible part of a much bigger exodus. The tragedy is that this brain drain makes everything worse. South Africa desperately needs smart, skilled people to rebuild, but the very dysfunction that creates that need is what drives them away. Meanwhile, big issues like land reform get buried under political noise. Yes, the government passed a law allowing land seizures without compensation, but no land has actually been taken as of today. It's more about political messaging than real action, and it's left everyone angry. White farmers feeling uncertain, and black South Africans still waiting for land they were promised. Then came Trump's tariffs. 30% on South African goods, hitting cars, wine, and agriculture hard, potentially wiping out $4 billion in exports over 2 years. Things hit a low point during Trump's tense meeting with President Ramaphosa in May 2025. Trump played dramatic videos of anti-white violence and talked about genocide. Ramaphosa tried to explain that everyone in South Africa is affected by crime, not just white farmers, but they were clearly having two completely different conversations. South Africa's economy is shrinking, yes, and its population is too. Births have dropped below 1 child per woman, and deaths now outnumber births 3 to 1. GDP per capita is lower than it was 15 years ago, and even with some increased health spending, a new VAT hike is about to hit poor families the hardest. The reality is that Trump's refugee program doesn't help. It validates exaggerated claims of white persecution while ignoring the broader collapse affecting everyone. And it sends a troubling message about who deserves protection, especially when refugees from Venezuela, Haiti, and Afghanistan are being turned away. But the families who left weren't wrong for wanting a better or more stable life without fearing potential persecution. And the real tragedy is that this isn't a story about race. It's about what happens when institutions crumble, leaders fail, and ordinary people are left to pay the price. That's the grim truth about South Africa that nobody wants to talk about. If stories like this matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more untold stories out there that need to be told, like how El Salvador is booming while Honduras is collapsing. Thank you for watching. World for public investment. Not only that, it's among the poorest countries in Latin America, which is still stuck on bananas and remittances to survive, with a GDP of just $34 billion. But just across the border is El Salvador, a country which is having its moment. It's one of the safest in the Western Hemisphere, which welcomed over 3.9 million visitors in 2024. This means it's doing great economy-wise, which grew by 2.6% last year alone. So, how did two countries that were born side by side have so different stories? Why is Honduras dying? Why is El Salvador booming?